Greetings. This is class 9 of belonging to each other and the planet. And today we're going to be talking about spirituality and science and what I believe to be a false polarity between those, a dualism. Um, and as you know, and it's a dualism that, in my opinion, serves entrenched power in what we've been calling the narcissistic paradigm. Um, as you as we've been experiencing as we talk about the various realms of the paradigm, duality is sort of the hallmark of the narcissistic view. The narcissistic view has never seen a polarity that it didn't like or exploit, and that it didn't, where the view wasn't to take sides, where we're supposed to be in favor of the victory of one side over the other, and where the other side is otherized. Um, so that dualism, like I said, is a hallmark of a narcissistic view of the world. And whereas integration and unity are the hallmark of the paradigm of communion, or of holism, which we've been talking about, is the paradigm we need to shift to if we want to find our belonging on the planet. And find a way to have human existence in history be compatible with the survival of the planet. Um, so if we set up that polarity, so the point is ultimately to heal the polarity between spirituality and science. And what both of those views have in common is that they desacralize life. They desacralize worldly existence. They desacralize our life and our animal existence and our existence, material existence in the world. Um, so on the fundamentalist side, fundamentalist a fundamentalist dogmatic doctrinal view of religion um, is, in my opinion, the opposite of genuine spirituality. So a fundamentalist and dogmatic and doctrinal view of religion is in contradiction to an actual, we'll talk more about why this is the case, but this is the basic point, is in contradiction to a genuine spirituality. And that view of religion serves power and disempowers ordinary people from living and respecting their own spiritual lives. On the other side, I mean, among liberals, it tends to be popular to say, science good, religion bad. And I want to say that science is one thing, just as fundamentalist religion doesn't represent true spirituality and true religion. What I'm going to call materialist science or dogmatic science or scientism is not real science. But so I'm not talking about genuine science. I'm talking about materialist science and a dogmatic view of science, and that view is not genuine science, but that view also serves power and disempowers ordinary people and separates us from our actual experience of being living beings on the planet. And there's a lot at stake here because the whole theme of this course is that we as a species are facing a crisis of belonging, and that's a critical crisis, and that we need to find ways to find our belonging, and that's the only way out of the crisis that we're at. So what we've been saying in this course is that no, we are not orphans. We are children of nature. Nature lives in us. We have been built by nature. We have within us the entire legacy of nature and the evolutionary process of nature to guide us, and we are resourced by nature with the internal guidance on how to belong. We're not uninvited orphans on the planet. And while the human experiment has pushed us to the edge, nature is both a loving, guiding, and a stern parent in the sense that it ultimately holds us accountable, simply because our actions reverberate and create consequences. But we're not only held accountable by nature, we are also resourced by nature and by our long evolutionary dialogue with nature, with the rest of the world, with life, with nature. And as we've said, the definition of belonging is twofold. It includes one, to take our place and be ourselves and fulfill our potentials. So it's not to sacrifice and get rid of our special gifts as a species or as individuals, and to offer and contribute and receive sustenance from the rest of the world, and to weave ourselves into the web of mutual dependencies that constitutes the whole, and that is the condition of the life for everything that exists. So a true belonging synthesizes separateness and connectedness, and is a dance, recognizes the dance between the two. So how can spirituality and science help us, not divide us and separate us from the world, help us to find our belonging, to overcome the duality? And what I'm arguing is that fundamentalist religion and materialist science have in common, that what they have in common is the desacralization of the natural world. What both fundamentalist religion and materialist science have in common is a desacralization of the natural world, and therefore everything in it, and therefore ourselves. So I'll start with the fundamentalist side, and then I'm going to talk about the scientific side. The fundamentalist side favors dogma over actual religious experience. It doesn't support actual religious experience. If you want, one way to think about it is that religion is a container and the spiritual experience is the wine in the container. And the religious experience is valuable to the extent that it serves as a container for the wine, which is an actual spiritual experience, and is anti-spiritual to the extent that it creates a dogma or an atmosphere that is contrary to the actual spiritual experience. So dogmatic religion is at the expense of spiritual experience. And spiritual experience, I'm defining spiritual experience as a sense of awe, of gratitude, of humility, of service, and surrender to something greater than us, to something meaningful and sacred. That we are in a spiritual experience when we experience awe, gratitude, humility, service, and surrender towards something that is greater than us and that is meaningful and sacred. There's a really good book that's on the reading list by Elaine Pagels. I think she pronounces it Pagels. Maybe it's Pagels. I don't really know. And she wrote a book called The Gnostic Gospel and another book called Beyond Belief. The point of Beyond Belief is that spiritual experience isn't a set of beliefs. It's an experience. So again, in terms of religion, if the images, rituals, iconography of and coming together as a community of a religion does serve as a host or a container for the spiritual experience, that's valuable. And when those things are counter to people having an actual spiritual, actually contacting their own spirituality, then that religious dogma is anti-spiritual. So some of the history of this is um, she talks about the Council of Nicaea, which was at the point when Christianity made the huge leap from being a persecuted sect to becoming a state religion. Um, and at that point, that which is when the Holy Roman Emperor in Constantinople converted to Christianity. And the Council of Nicaea was convened by the emperor to essentially create a state religion that would support the empire. And one of the things it was to do was to decide what of the many gospels and somewhat um, so there was a whole verbal history of this is 400 years after Christ. There was a whole history of verbal traditions of people who were following what they considered the Christian religion, Christian the example of Christ, the message of Christ. Um, but the point of the Council of Nicaea was to decide the official Bible, to choose what of the many Gospels got to be official and which were to be left out of the Bible. And Pagel says a lot of what was left out was some of the aspects of the Gnostic, Gnostic, the Gnostic Gospels that left out some of the more radical and less socially controllable versions of the Christian message. And that included some quotes like one of the quotes from the Gnostic Gospel is, "Whatsoever you do unto these, ye do unto me." Christ is saying, "Whatsoever ye do unto these, ye do unto me." That is to say, when you abuse anyone, you're abusing me, Christ. You're abusing God. It's unclear whether Christ ever claimed to be God, but there's that unity there is if you abuse anybody, you're abusing Christ. And another example of a quote there, um, the kingdom of heaven is all around ye, and ye see it not. The kingdom of heaven is all around ye, and ye see it not. So sacredness, the kingdom of heaven is here. It's not up in the sky. It's not someplace else. So now there's somewhat tamed down versions of that in the official Bible. Um, But the point is, though, that's sort of the radical edge of the Christian message that we all have God inside, that we can contact God by going inside and deep into our own spirituality. Um, so those were kicked out, and and the point it was at that point that was made clear that Christ was apart from us. Christ is the one and only God. Christ is not like Buddha. Christ is not unlike Buddha. Christ is not a enlightened human being who recognizes their godliness and their relationship to God that's in him and everyone else, who recognizes that we're all children of God. Christ is separate from everyone else. Christ is apart and is the one and only God. So the godness rather than the human side of Christ was consolidated in that view, and any other view was then became heretical. But the most dramatic thing they did at the Council of Nicaea, this is mind blowing, was they said the age of revelation is over. The age of revelation is over. God has said everything he wants to say to human beings by now. It's all been said. And we, the church, are the receivers and the monitors and the teachers and the spreaders of what God said to us. We are the keepers of what God has said. And there's no further revelation to happen. And what's dramatic about that is if you think you have a revelation, if you think God is speaking to you, if you think you're having a spiritual relationship with God, because the age of revelation is over, it's actually the devil. You're being seduced by the devil when you think you're having a spiritual experience that's not modulated by the church, that's not mediated by the church. And so you're being seduced by the devil to think you're having a spiritual experience, but it's not a real one. It is actually a heretical one. If you think you're having an experience, a spiritual experience not mediated by the church, you are a heretic and you will be dealt with accordingly, which includes being burned. That was a little later before it got to that. But so it's a separating of us from God, separating us from spirit, separating us from a spiritual experience, and cutting off any direct access that human beings would have to God or to spirit or to Christ. So it's separating us. And then St. Augustine, took that a step further, essentially, in saying that in separating us from the world and from our bodies, that the world and our bodies are profane and essentially dirty. And so with that view then now that cuts off our getting to have an internal experience of the sacred or to celebrate the sacred communally in a way that's not mediated by the official church or to have any rites that are not approved by the church, such as ecstatic dances and a whole lot of rites that had developed around the early Christian religion. So the sacred now is elsewhere. The sacred is not in us and can't be contacted there. The sacred is not in the world. Heaven is in another realm, and God is outside of his creation. God is a designer, a ruler, a monarch who sits outside of creation. It's not to be found in creation. So it cuts us off from accessing our inner guidance in our bodies or in nature. It essentially says that both nature and we are unworthy of spirituality. And what this obviously does is consolidate. You can see the democratic dangers of a view that says we all get to have our own relationship with God, or for different communities to create their own relationship with God. So this is back to the basic original point. It's a desacralization of the world, of nature, and of us. Sacredness is somewhere else. The world is low. Now, what may be harder for some of us to see is that materialist science does the same thing. Materialist science also takes the view. Material science also desacralizes the world. Now, again, that's not real science I'm talking about, but what I've been calling scientism, or a materialist view of science, or a dogmatic or simplistic view of science, also desacralizes the world. Now, real science is a process and not a result. It's an ongoing model or hypothesis that helps us understand the world. science oversteps itself when it presents itself as a result, as its results, as definitive facts, and sets itself up as the arbitrator of objective truth. Okay, real science is an ongoing process and a method that supports an ongoing process of questioning, building models, seeing if they work, seeing where they need to be adjusted, building new models and ways of understanding the world. It's an ongoing process. It's not a result. And when simplistic science claims that it is the arbiter of objective fact, when it sets itself up as the arbiter of objective truth, it is overstepping its bounds. And it invites a justified backlash. And we're experiencing that now. And those of us who are saying, well, we believe in science and everybody else is ignorant and stupid and just doesn't, we're missing something important. So why does science claiming to be the arbiter of objective truth and reality, why does that provoke a backlash? And I'm saying a justified backlash. So I'm going to talk about some of the ways. One, people are sure to notice that the conclusions keep changing. That's not a criticism of real science. Real science is a process in which the conclusion ought to be changing. But if you present itself, we know the truth, this is what it is, and then next week, next year, 5 years later, 10 years later, we say, no, now we know the objective truth. That was all superstition, that old stuff, but now we know the truth, and we're science, so believe us. Science loses credibility. It's also a problem because science is used by those who can afford to sponsor double-blind studies, for instance. I remember a class I taught where there was a guest speaker, and the guest speaker was at Berkeley. The guest speaker was a man named Goffman, who was essentially the world expert, the only world expert not industry controlled in the world. And he went to Chernobyl and all, where he basically was studying the effects of radiation all around the world. And he said, look out for this. The people who are defending the nuclear industry will tell you things like, there is no scientific evidence to say that, and whatever they want to defend against. So there's no scientific evidence to prove that cigarette smoke will kill you, to prove that asbestos will kill you, to prove that radiation is harmful, to prove that certain pesticides are harmful. There's no, the phrase that the industry will use is, there's no scientific evidence. And the reason that the way they can get away with that is that what they mean is there has not been a convincing, absolute, double-blind study to prove this. And they will argue that whatever studies were done, they will argue that they're deficient, and therefore there's no scientific evidence. So, and that's what happens. So the point is that the scientific view is used by the asbestos industry, by the tobacco industry, by the radiation industry, by the nuclear industry. I meant to say by the nuclear industry and by the big pharma. It's hugely influenced by the financial interests by large financial interests. And three, its scientific conclusions are not objective in the sense that their conclusions are always going to be shaped by the questions that are asked, the questions that science is trying to answer. And those questions will always be shaped by the hypotheses that are being proven or disproven. And those hypotheses are also within a cultural worldview. They will always be a reflection of a particular cultural worldview. They will never be objective. They will also be, to some degree, ideological. Now, that's not actually a criticism of science because because all knowledge is part of a cultural process in which we of an evolving cultural process in which we're trying to best understand the world and the ongoing revolution and testing of that worldview by its results in the life of the world. So to say that science is not objective but is culturally shaped and part of a cultural learning process that involves a worldview and the hypotheses that come from that worldview, that's not a legitimate criticism of science because that's true of all knowledge, all human understanding. What's false is the claim that scientific knowledge is somehow exempt from or above or objective, is somehow objective in a way that is exempt from cultural worldviews. So what's wrong is the claim to be exempt from those views. Um, Now, science, we're talking about the backlash to science, but science provokes the strongest backlash and resistance, science meaning scientism, when it sets itself in opposition to a spiritual view of the world. When it says you have to choose between a scientific view and a spiritual view of the world. If science wants to stake out and base its claim to objectivity by saying we are only going to believe measurable truth, we're only going to believe those things where there's been a scientific study that gives us a measurable result and measurable truth. If science wants to say we're specializing in measurable truth, and that's what we have to offer, you want measurable truth, talk to us, then it has to be agnostic on all those aspects of reality that can't be measured. It has no standing on to have an opinion or anything to say, no claim to have no legitimate standing to have anything to say about anything that can't be measured. If that's what they mean by we're objective and other views of the world are not. And it is trespassing when it claims to have a scientific basis for to have an outlook on things that can't be measured. Um, and now that was very interesting when I talked about this before. It turns out that Watson of Watson and Crick, who was one of the great scientists of our time, they discovered the double helix, and there was a debate about whether there's a spirit or vitalism in nature. And he said, you know what, I'm a scientist, and I looked through at the cells through an atomic microscope, and I looked in there, and I can tell you there's no vital principle. There's no spiritual thing there. It's just a material. So now this is a great scientist, and that's stupid because by definition, if you're saying, is there anything other than material, and you're using a method that will show you just the material, you won't see it. And I think I shared before, my 11 or 12-year-old son said, what was he expecting to see? Little globules that had an S on it for spiritual? What was he expecting to see? So, because what that's missing is that it's not the parts, but it's the relationship between the parts that creates a whole where spirituality lies, where wholeness lies, where something beyond the material lies. Not exclusive from the material, based on the material, but where the material and spiritual meet. Um, and what's really interesting about this is actually the more trivial something is, the more measurable it is, and the more important it is, the less measurable it is. So if you want to know how many apples a particular orchard is producing and whether it's producing more after you use a certain fertilizer, that's pretty simple to measure. Even then, there's judgment. Like, what's an apple? Are the runts or the rotten apples or those count or don't they? There's always decisions to be made. But it's pretty straightforward. But if you are trying to measure, but if you're talking about something more important, like love or purpose or meaning or beauty, the less measurable they are. The more important, the more meaningful something is, the less measurable it is, because the more subjective it is in the sense of how we understand it. Um, there can be debates about the proxies. Science will find a proxy like, okay, we don't know what beauty is, but if we take a poll and people who move towards it or away from it, we'll use that, we'll measure that, or we'll measure. So scientism, or materialist, crudely materialist science, um, gets into the most trouble when it gets out of its lane and causes the most division and resistance when it goes out of its lane. And it goes most out of its lane. It creates the most resistance when it takes on the core of the spiritual view. When it takes on spirituality, takes on the core of the spiritual view, which is essentially the view that life has meaning. I think to me, that's the core of the spiritual view, that our lives has meaning, and our lives have meaning because we are participating in a meaningful and sacred whole. And that life has meaning. Okay. Now, on the question of does life have meaning, simplistic materialist science, not real science, um, gives an emphatic no. Life does not have meaning. Nature and reality are essentially a random material process. It's blind, it's random, it's purely material, and it has no meaning. There's no purpose or soul or spirit or direction or learning or cognition in the natural processes. Essentially, the model is that nature is a machine and that everything can be understood and explained in a mechanical way, and that any attempt to give meaning to it is sort of a pathetic attempt on people who aren't strong enough to face reality, to deal with reality. And if you think that life has meaning, purpose, direction, intelligence intrinsic to it, um, then you will be accused of anthropomorphism. Now, there's a reason for that. There's a good reason for that. Uh, the good reason for the concern about anthropomorphism is the danger. That's a reaction. The saying, don't be anthropomorph, no anthropomorphism allowed, is a response to the danger of us projecting our values onto nature and then using that to justify our values. The most obvious example of that is um, to project the divine right of kings onto nature. Nature is structured, in a hierarchy, and God, king, nobles, peasants, and so we're projecting those values onto nature, and then we're turning around and saying, um, therefore, nature justifies that particular system. So there's a good reason for us to be concerned about anthropomorphizing the world. So the desire there is to avoid anthropomorphism, which is to say, to not impute human like intentions or agency onto nature. Human-like intentions or agency onto nature. And hidden in that view is the most extreme anthropomorphism. Hidden in the view of let's not project meaning and value and all that stuff and purpose onto nature. Hidden in the view, let's not do that because those are human things, is an extreme anthropomorphism because it defines purpose, spirit, agency, learning, cognition, meaning in human terms. Only humans have purpose, spirit, agency, learning, cognition, meaning. You define those in human terms. Therefore, ergo, nothing non-human or pre-human or more than just human in the sense of the whole, such as a planet or an ecosystem or universe, nothing can have these exclusively human qualities because they're being defined as exclusively human qualities. Absent these human qualities, since only we own these things, the material world has no meaning. It's a purely materialistic and random process. It's essentially a machine. So the result is, like dogmatic religion, paired with dogmatic religion, the world is desacralized, and any effort to see a meaning to life is a superstitious delusion for those who aren't brave enough to face the cold, hard facts about how the world is. Again, the dominant metaphor then, the best, by that model, the best way to understand the world is as a machine. That's a little similar, you notice, to the fundamentalist view, because if it's a machine, then the meaning or you see, that sets up the other idea. Well, if the world is a machine, who made it? Oh, well, that's God. The intention is somewhere else, not intrinsic to the workings of nature, but separate from it. So it's this view that there's nothing sacred in the world. This view that there's nothing sacred about the world, which is the view of scientism when it oversteps its mandate. This is what the backlash to science is a reaction to. It's a reaction to the view, to what's understood by people as the view that life has no meaning. So again, the desacralization of earthly life is shared by a fundamentalist religion, which says meaning is not in the world, it's in God. And then we can have wars over what the correct view of God is. And we project meaning onto whatever version of God we choose. And that then becomes encoded in a dogma that's not to be questioned. And on the scientistic side, meaning is a superstitious fantasy for the weak mind. So where that brings us to is, can there be a meaning, spirit, direction, intelligence in nature that can support us in our present crisis of belonging on the planet? This is why it's critical, right? Are we orphans and alone? Is all of the miracle of life simply a stage setting for the human drama? Do we just stand on top of the processes of nature, alone and orphaned? Because nature itself, the life process itself, has no meaning, spirit, direction, intelligence. And therefore, it has nothing to teach us. There's nothing we can learn from nature. We're alone in facing the crossroads that we face as a species of trying to find a belonging in the world. So do we stand alone and unresourced in our crisis? Or, and that's back to the poem, right? Your great mistake is to think you are you're acting the play alone. Let go of your proud isolation and drop into the community of things. That's my paraphrase right now of that poem um, by Michael White, by David White. Um, or are we unresourced by nature and alone in trying to find belonging and trying to solve our crisis? Or are we an ongoing participant in nature's process and thus resourced and able to access the guidance of nature's process and all the wisdom that nature has accumulated, that life has accumulated in constructing and building us, and that continues to be the ongoing ground of our existence, built into us. I'm going to say that again. Are we alone and orphaned? Or are we an ongoing participant in nature's process and thus resourced and able to access the guidance of, resourced by nature and able to access the guidance of nature, of nature's process, and all the wisdom that nature has accumulated in constructing and building us, and that continues to be the ongoing ground of our existence built into us, the ongoing miracle of our life. Because nature has dealt with the issues we face at every level of its existence. The problem of belonging, the problem of parts coming together and forming mutually beneficial relationships that join them into greater wholes, and that whole in turn having qualities that transcend the sum of the parts, forming new beings that did not exist before, and the whole feeding back to make adaptive those parts of the whole whose way of being is compatible with the needs of the whole. That's an ancient process. And our existence today rests on the fact that nature has negotiated this process from the beginning of time and encoded the results in our DNA, our bodies, our emotions, our instincts, our hearts, our guts, our brains. And one way of saying that is there something we can learn from our elders, from our forebears, from our ancestors, from the cell to the slime mold to the organisms and everything that built up to the complexity of our bodies and our existence. Now, this more belonging view of our existence is crept into real science, not into simplistic science, but into real science of biology by some very sophisticated people who are doing this work. It's still groundbreaking work, but it's an opening. And an example of that is an article in a magazine called a publication called Aeon, Aeon, which you can Google. And one article there that my friend Peter sent me is called Cognition All the Way Down. Cognition All the Way Down. It's an article by Michael Levin, Levin, and Daniel Dennett, Dennet. And this is what they call it, the next great horizon. They say the next great horizon in biology is to understand cells, tissues, and organism as agents with agendas. These supposedly human qualities exist in a non-human form, not in a different form, in a non-human version of those qualities. But that calling it an agenda makes sense on the level of a cell. And another thing they say is the point is not to anthropomorphize morphogenesis. Morphogenesis is the creation of new biological forms. The point of this is not to anthropomorphize the creation of new life. The point is to naturalize cognition, to use cognition in a much broader sense, not to mean cognition in the human sense, but that there's something we can call cognition, and therefore that's a relative of what we do, a forebear of what we do, that's done on a pre-human level. I'm going to share screen here some excerpts from this article and read it. So the first thing is from this article I just talked about. It's a long article, but this is a key phrase in it. Instead of treating human genius as a sort of black box made of magical smart stuff, we can reinterpret it as an explosive expansion of the bag of mechanical but cognitive tricks discovered by natural selection over billions of years. By distributing intelligence over time, eons of evolution and years of learning and development and milliseconds of computation and space, by distributing the intelligence, by distributing the notion of intelligence over time and space, we have not just smart brains and smart neurons, but smart tissues and cells and proofreading enzymes and ribosomes. The mysteries of life can be unified in a single breathtaking vision, which is to say that our existence is an accumulation of intelligence and decisions that have been made on microscopic levels, on the cell level, on the tissue level, and so forth. Another quote about that is from Antonio Damasio, who is probably the primary student of mind and brain, the relationship of mind and brain. And he says, I'm just going to read the blue parts. Unminded intelligence precedes the variety of intelligence based on minds. Unminded intelligence precedes the variety of intelligence based on minds by a few billion years. Unminded intelligence is concealed in the depths of biology. Unminded intelligence is well hidden behind the workings of molecular pathways that accomplish smart things for living organisms. Unminded intelligence manifests itself widely in reflexes, in habits, in emotive behaviors, in competition and cooperation among organisms. Be mindful of the mindless. Be mindful of the mindless. Please realize that we, the lofty and minded humans, also benefit from unminded intelligence mechanisms at all hours of the day. So the point is that intelligence and direction and intention are not necessarily just the province of creatures with brains or creatures with human brains and the mind that's associated with a human brain. And one place where a concept from this that's really, really helpful in distinguishing between anthropomorphism and understanding that we are related to and unified, that it's a continuum, that we're part of a continuum, is the concept of reach. The concept of reach. So, and so when you say cognition all the way down, it means that you're saying that cells, for instance, make decisions and alliances and connections within their reach. So, for instance, a cell is a semi-permeable has a semi-permeable membrane. In that membrane, that cell decides what to let in and what to keep out, what to protect itself from and what to connect with. And that intelligence causes the cell to make choices in what alliances it makes with other cells and when and where and with whom to create tissue. Um, so that's so that's the way that a cell, for example, deals with the issue of both being separate and belonging. That is precisely the issue of belonging that we are faced with, but at our level of reach. So it would be anthropomorphic to say that the cell joins other cells because it knows and wants, after it's done that, those tissues to lead to organs, and it wants those organs to lead to separate organisms, and it hopes in joining with other cells to form a tissue that it ultimately will get to create human beings. So of course that that is an anthropomorphic view. But to say that within its level of reach, it is also negotiating the fundamental problem of being itself and being in relationship, that is with that is its intelligence on the level its level of reach. So cells are forming a tissue. That means they're making an alliance. And once you have a tissue, those cells that are compatible with a tissue, with being in a tissue, are adaptive, and the others are sloughed off. So there's being decisions made in those alliances. For example, a cancer cell is excluded from a healthy body. And it's excluded for a healthy body because its ambition, when it wins, it's at the expense of the coherence of the whole organism. And ultimately, the cancer cell is stupid because it ultimately doesn't get to thrive because when the cancer cells decides my goal is to turn every cell, the liver cell, for instance, into cancer cells, guess what? It kills the liver. Guess what? It kills its host. And guess what? It kills itself. So there's a process whereby there's a selection in the coming together of cells that are compatible with each other. And once those create an organism, those cells that are continue to be compatible with with the life of an organism have an adaptive advantages, and those who don't get sloughed off. It's an analogy to an antisocial individual um, that gets left on the ice floe because they're just not working out for the society, or for a species that destroy right a species that is in danger of destroying the ecological its own ecological support system. So the idea of reach helps us with the issue of anthropomorphism. This again, the cell isn't saying I'm going to exchange fluid with this cell so as to create a process that will ultimately lead to organs in animals and humans. It's not a goal conceived. The goal is not beyond its reach. Nature is nature is not a goal, but a process. The cell doesn't have a grand plan that's equivalent to a human plan. It doesn't have a goal or an aim or meaning on the human level. It has that on its within the level of its own reach. Now, the human uniqueness has something to do with our ability to conceive of goals at an unprecedented level of reach. That is, say, the consequences of the goals we choose and the means we employ, the means we have access that we can employ to meet our goals um, are unprecedented in terms of their consequences and their reach in the world. So the question is, can our tools, particularly our prefrontal cortex, our neocortex, particularly our peculiarly, uniquely human consciousness, can that extend and keep up with the reach, with the consequences of our actions? And that depends on that fact that can our conscious mind be in service to the life process? So can it be in service to our internal heritage, the wholeness of our evolved selves, our emotions, our body, our guts? And that depends on seeing the process of life as intrinsically sacred. Can we have our goals compatible? Can we have our goals compatible with our reach, so that our actions are compatible with the existence of the whole, given the reach of our ability to affect the whole? And to get it to harness our peculiarly human qualities to the whole depends on seeing the process of life as intrinsically sacred. This is why a desacralization of the world is a way of orphaning ourselves and being alone in the world. It depends on seeing the process of life as intrinsically sacred, which is to say, to be guided by the appropriate awe, wonder, humility, and gratitude that the sacred requires. Can our relationship to life, to the rest of life, to the whole of life, to the miracle of life, to everything that went before, to the ancestors in the beyond human sense, can our relationship to them be to see life as sacred? That is to say, to meet life with the appropriate awe, wonder, humility, and gratitude necessary to have a belonging, to reestablish or relearn our belonging in life. That is to say, we would be neither kings of the world nor abandoned orphans, but members of life. Can we find our belonging as good citizens of life? We are not orphans if we humble ourselves enough to learn from our elders. If we don't orphan ourselves, we're not orphans unless we orphan ourselves. Looked at in this way, we can recognize that intelligence, learning, reaching, striving, connecting, forming relationships, forming alliances, creating new wholes, co-creating networks, creating greater wholes and networks are not exclusively human inventions. That intelligence, learning, reaching, striving, connecting, forming relationships, forming alliances, creating new wholes, co-creating networks, creating greater wholes and networks are not exclusively human inventions. That there is something that we could call a striving or direction or intelligence or meaning intrinsic in the process of life. It's not meaningless, nor is the meaning put into it by some God or outside force. Intrinsic to the process of life that underlies and transcends the human version of these. Is there something that we could call a striving or direction or intelligence intrinsic to the process of life that underlies and transcends the human version of these? Is there an ancient process of life that underlies our existence? A miracle that deserves and requires us to treat it as sacred. A miracle that deserves and requires us to treat it as sacred. And thereby to find our belonging. And this might be a place where the insights that science is stumbling its way towards may be best expressed by a poet. This is Rilke. Nothing to frighten us. Nothing to frighten us. We are not prisoners. No traps or snares are set around us. There's nothing that should frighten or torment us. We have been put into life as into the element we most accord with. We have, moreover, through millennia of adaptation, come to resemble life so greatly that we, when we hold still, through a happy mimicry, can hardly be distinguished from everything that surrounds us. That's Rilke in 1904. Nothing to frighten us. We are not prisoners. No traps or snares have been set around us. There is nothing that should frighten or torment us. We've been put into life as into the element we most accord with. And we have, moreover, through millennia of adaptation, come to resemble this life so greatly that we, when we hold still, through a happy mimicry, can hardly be distinguished from everything that surrounds us. And that's the presentation for Class 9 of Belonging to the Planet and Each Other. Thanks a lot, and see you later.